Here's how to use all of the spells in the lore of metal. We begin with Plague of Rust. This is a minus 30 armor debuff, lasts for 44 seconds and only costs 4 winds of magic. This all quite simply is about making the enemy take more damage. And then there's the Overcast version, which doubles the effect for a measly extra 2 winds of magic, so still very cheap. One of the simplest ways to use this spell is to save it for the enemy lord and get them in a bad situation, and then drop that Plague of Rust. This will put some extra damage on a very important target that we definitely want to kill. However, as in this example, we're being a little bit ineffective here, because all these units that I've got the lord trapped by are armor piercing, and armor piercing damage actually ignores armor, so minus 30 armor, minus 60 armor doesn't make a blind bit of difference to the majority of their damage. It only affects the base damage, which is smaller on these armor piercing units. So Halberds, Demigryphs and Theodore Bruckner are going to gain a little bit of a damage boost from this, but not much. So where can we more effectively use this spell? Well, that'll be in your non-armor piercing units, those without the little armor piercing symbol, indicating that the majority of their damage is base damage and not armor piercing damage. As you can see, 31 versus 11 here. So with this example, Infernal Guard versus Bloodletters, who might only have 35 armor, you might think it's not worth it to put it on them, but taking them from 35 to 5 armor can make quite a big impact on the amount of damage the Infernal Guard will be able to do. And you can see in this situation, this one unit has got Plague of Rust minus 30, so they're down to 5 armor, and then next to them we got the same fight going on, but no Plague of Rust on the Bloodletters, and here's the difference. After 44 seconds of Plague of Rust and taking that extra damage, the affected unit is nearly done for, while the other unit is still at about half health. So any unit that's primarily base weapon damage, this is going to be helpful for. Something like Reiksguard, same sort of experiment here, 1 unit with Plague of Rust, 1 without, 2 Reiksguard hitting Chaos Warriors who are very heavily armored, but a minus 60 on them brings them down to 40 armor. And we can see after 1 big charge and staying in there for the 44 second duration, the Chaos Warriors that got Plague of Rusted are down to 3,500 health, while the ones that didn't get Plague of Rusted are at 5,000 health. So it allowed the Reiksguard to do a nice bit of extra damage. This is also a great spell to combo up with missile units of the base damage variety, especially if you're targeting a large single entity. This can be a great way to boost their damage output, and it's actually a double whammy here as the Marauder Champion Infantry that are fighting the Bloodthirster also are a base weapon damage unit, so it's helping them both do some extra damage to this smelly demon bastard. So you want to apply Plague of Rust to any armored unit to support your non-armor piercing units. I'd say use the Overcast version if it's a particularly important unit or one that has a lot of armor. That being said, there are some situations where you can use it to support even your armor piercing units, like I'm doing with Demigryphs here to help them kill these Chaos Knights faster, because Demigryphs actually have quite high base damage as well as high armor piercing damage, so it does benefit them, as you will find with some elite units. Next we have Searing Doom. This is a bombardment spell. Its damage overall is mostly armor piercing, magical attacks as well, and it's pretty cheap at 6 winds of magic. And then there's the Overcast version, which just hits a bigger area with more projectiles, costs 10 winds of magic. This honestly is just a very simple and reliable spell. Fill that circle up with as many enemy bodies as possible and drop it on their faces. It does pretty good damage to both lighter and more heavily armored units, but of course the stronger of an enemy unit you use it on, the more value you're going to get from it. It is one to use on enemies that are engaged in combat, otherwise the AI is pretty good at dodging this spell because it does take a little while to come down. You also can't really use it in thin frontline fights like this because you are going to be hitting your own unit if you want to try and fill the circle, so it's usually not worth it unless it's an expendable unit of yours and a very expensive unit of the enemies. As for the Overcast version, it can be very difficult to fill that circle with enough bodies to make it worthwhile, I think. Because if you're going to use it something like this, half the circle isn't even filled, so it's just a massive waste. If you can get it maybe 80% plus full, then it might be worth going for. Maybe in choke point situations, you might be able to do that. Otherwise, you're probably just better off spamming the little normal version. So look out for those moments when the enemy units kind of go into a circular ballish formation. Whether it's infantry, cavalry, monsters, they can all be hit pretty well as long as they're tightly packed in the circle. And then we have Glittering Robe. This is plus 60 armor for a 44 second duration, 6 winds of magic. So kind of similar to Plague of Rust, but just the opposite effect, and for us. Keep that in mind and everything I said about Plague of Rust and base damage and armor piercing damage, because it applies here too. There is of course an upgraded version of this spell, turning it into an area effect so you can hit more than a single unit, but it does double the magic cost. So this is a spell similar to Plague of Rust where you need to be careful of base damage and armor piercing damage. Because if you give 60 armor to your unit while it's fighting an armor piercing unit, that 60 armor doesn't really mean anything because the armor piercing damage ignores the armor anyway. As is happening here with these Bloodletters versus Empire Swordsmen. One of the swordsmen was protected by Glittering Robe, but at the end of its duration you can see it hasn't made a blind bit of difference to the survival of that unit on the left. They've both broken about the same time. So we need to use this spell to protect from non-armor piercing base damage units, like Saurus Warriors, a base damage unit with high weapon strength. They can be very dangerous. I'm going to drop the Glittering Robe on all 3 of my swordsmen with the Overcast version. That's going to give them that 60 armor, protecting from that high base damage weapon strength of the Saurus. This is where the spell is useful. Because base weapon damage isn't guaranteed to land, the higher your armor, the less chance the enemy has of doing more of that base damage. It's all on a hidden dice roll. So you don't need to worry about whether your unit is armor piercing or not, but you do need to worry about whether the enemy unit is armor piercing or not with this spell. Mostly with infantry and cavalry. It can be useful for single entities as well, lords and heroes. If your lord is fighting a non-armor piercing, mostly base damage enemy unit, then Glittering Robe could serve as a nice bit of cheap protection, but you've really got to look for those matchups where it could actually be useful. And then we have Gianna's Golden Hounds. This is a randomly moving vortex. About a third of its damage is armor piercing, magical attacks as well, costs 8 winds of magic. And then there's the Overcast version, which just doubles the length of the spell for 4 extra magic, bringing it to 12. Now personally, I'm not a huge fan of randomly moving vortexes because there's a little RNG involved on whether they'll do good work or even hurt your own units. They could even end up being a complete waste of the magic spent. So first of all, be careful using this around your own units because it may mess them up more than the enemy potentially. For that reason, it could be good against lightly armored missile units because they'll be by themselves. You do have the RNG of whether it'll go away from the unit though and won't really hit them too much, as it's slightly doing here, but it's not too bad. It's still doing a good amount of damage to these Kossars, so probably worth the winds of magic. Obviously, any kind of big ball of enemy troops like so in choke point is a great spot for this, although slight risk to your unit if they are holding them there. If you can get the spell landing right on top of enemies for its entirety, it will definitely do some solid damage. Another good spot you can use this kind of spell is in the middle of the enemy formation. If they're just sitting there and not coming to you, you can drop it in the middle of a bunch of their units and it's pretty much guaranteed to hit something. In this case, it's smashing these Plague Monks pretty well, but even if it had gone in another direction, it still would have hit something else of value. In this case, some Plague Monks here, some Storm Vermin, so look for those expensive spots in the enemy army. And this is one of the few places where it may be justified using the Overcast version because it does go on for twice as long, so it'll have a fair amount of time to bounce around in the enemy formation. But as you can see here, the randomly moving part comes in and it goes off and does absolutely nothing for half the spell, so I may as well have just done the normal non-Overcast version anyway. But yeah, overall a strong spell, lots of damage that can be done with this, but some risk to yourself if you use it near your units. It could backfire, it could go off in a direction and do nothing. If you don't mind the RNG element, it's a great spell. Personally, I'd rather just spam off Searing Doom rather than use this. But this is, as I mentioned, better for missile units because the AI doesn't attempt to dodge this spell because they don't have time, whereas they will with Searing Doom, so it's good in that regard. Next up, Transmutation of Lead. Now this is another spell that, kind of similar to Glittering Robe, is just designed to protect us from damage in some way, and primarily base damage. But it is an area spell, lasts 50 seconds for 11 winds of magic. So not cheap, but not expensive either, and the Overcast version doubles the base weapon damage debuff to 60% from 30% for 16 winds of magic. Now it's a little expensive. This, quite simply, can be used in the same way as Glittering Robe. Use it on those units that don't have high armor-piercing damage, like Saurus, Forsaken, Witch Elves, Awesome Cavalries, Reichsguard, Dragon Princes, Blood Knights. These will all get seriously debuffed by this spell. Whereas if they're an armor-piercing unit, they won't really feel that sting so much, although the minus 24 melee attack will hurt them. But as we can see here, 2 of these Forsaken units were hit with Transmutation of Lead, while this other one wasn't. So as we can see here, this one unit that wasn't supported by Transmutation of Lead has 3,300 health, so that's just a straight-up fight with the Forsaken, whereas one of these other units that was protected by the debuff has 5,300, and this other one 5,600, so a fair saving on their health. Ultimately, as I mentioned, this spell is kind of the same as Glittering Robe, so why would you use one over the other? Well, Glittering Robe doesn't seem to protect quite as well as Transmutation of Lead, but it doesn't cost as much, so that all works out. It can also be cast on a single target, whereas Transmutation of Lead, it's kind of wasteful to cast it on a single target because it's an area spell. I did a little test to see the difference. I had one of my units with Glittering Robe on it, and the other one, its enemy was debuffed by Transmutation of Lead, and you'll see in a second that Transmutation of Lead did protect better, but of course it cost more Winds of Magic, and you'd need a few more units in that circle to really make the most of that magical money you spent. And we see here the Glittering Robe unit has 5,900 health left, while the Transmutation Protected unit has 6,300. So not a huge difference, but a difference all the same. So ultimately, Transmutation is a bit of a better spell because it has the reduction to melee attack, which is helpful and full, and can also be overcast to do minus 60 base damage, which is going to be especially harmful to those units with high base damage weapon strength. But the difficulty with both these spells is finding those situations where it's going to be useful in a hurry in the heat of battle. It's not always easy. Sometimes it's just easier to drop a quick Searing Doom. And then we have one of my favorite spells in the game, Final Transmutation. This is an absolutely disgusting spell if used correctly. It is direct damage to an area, a pretty chunky amount, only lasts 8 seconds in the normal version, and costs a pretty chunky 17 Winds of Magic. The Overcast version lasts twice as long, 16 seconds, but does cost a pretty hefty 26 Winds of Magic. So with this spell, you're basically looking for the most clumped up area of elite expensive troops that you can find, preferably with a character or two in there. In this case, we've got Archaon, we got some Trolls, we got Chaos Warriors, there's a hero here as well. And on the unit card, it tells you that this spell is good against characters, which it is, but it can also hurt just about anything. And if you find enough expensive stuff all in one small place, this spell can do absolutely disgusting amounts of damage. As we'll see from old Balthazar here, as he drops an Overcast version of the spell, 26 Winds of Magic, gonna last the 16 seconds though, so we're getting a lot of time on this direct damage, and you can see the health starts falling off the units pretty damn quickly. Even Archaon, who is a beefcake, the Exalted Hero is nearly down to half health already, so quite easily you can take a couple of thousand health off Lords and Heroes with this, and by the end of it, if we take a look at Balthazar's damage done in gold, it's 1,500 goddamn damage from that one spell. So if you can pull it off, this spell can do some serious damage. You just want to look for those clumps of elite troops and even maybe try to lure some into the area if one of your characters is being pursued. If we can get them all over here, I've got Archaon and a couple of units of Chosen. I've got a hero just to my left, Aspiring Champions here. We could try and hit them as well. So running my Demigryphs over here to pull in Archaon and these characters over here to pull in this hero. And we can hit all of these units in one big Final Transmutation. Personally, I'll only use this spell in the upgraded form because it does do just so much damage, but only if I can find the right situation, usually with at least 2 characters. Any more though is of course even better. You can see a Cockatrice is going to join in here, so that's extra damage for us, very nice, and we can damage some of the most expensive and useful parts of the enemy army with this spell, and it's just very easy. There is some RNG involved, right? If a unit moves out of the circle, it won't get hurt anymore, which as I mentioned, I generally try to avoid, but with this spell, I can overlook it because it is so damn good. Balthazar at nearly 1,700 damage from that spell, although I may have had a little damage done already before it, but still, it's a nasty spell. But do be warned, it is very expensive. If it doesn't go right, it's going to be a massive waste of your Winds of Magic, so you've got to be careful with it and try to use it in the right spot. So there we go, all the spells in the Lore of Metal. I hope you've enjoyed this. Thanks for watching. I got a whole playlist of this scheisse right here. Check it out if you wish. Otherwise, I'll see you in the future.